Change is easy. Transition is hard, but most things that are worthwhile don't come easily. The same is true when it comes to transitioning a dairy farming business from one generation to the next. And our guest today is a partner with his brother and cousin in Swisslane Farms in Michigan, a fast-paced dairy that is laser focused on goals and growth. But as you are about to hear from Tommy Oesch, transitioning ownership, management, and decision making from one generation to the next wasn't simple. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. We are talking about the real challenges and successes of Swisslane Farms generational succession here today on the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. This is the podcast for dairy farm owners, managers, and advisors who are committed to profitability, sustainability, and excellence. I'm Peggy Coffeen, and it's my mission to bring you the conversations that will uplevel your skill set and your mindset so you can be a top performer in the dairy farming business. And I have a quick favor to ask. If you enjoy the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, please take a minute to give us a 5-star rating and write a review. Let us know what you are getting out of the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. Your comments, your ratings, and your reviews help us continue to grow and serve you, our friends in the dairy industry. This conversation today is so good, I'm breaking it down in 2 parts. Today, you're going to hear about Tommy's path that led him to a successful career in the industry for several years, that in fact made it difficult to come back to the family farm. You're going to hear about the critical conversations they had as family and business partners about the futures that each generation desired and how they came together on a plan to get there and made it happen. Tommy, how often do you end up talking with your dairy industry peers about transitioning from one generation to the next?
It's probably the most common question I get from new relationships that I have in the industry or people that I talk to is like, they see us as a dairy who has kind of gotten through the management transition to my generation from the senior generation. And so a lot of people are pretty stuck. The thing is, there's a huge disparity even in age of who's struggling with it, right? Like the senior generation on a dairy, some of them are in their 50s with kids, early 50s, even late 40s with kids that are out of high school now. And shoot, I have a freshman in high school and I'm 42. So before I'm 50, right? And my cousin, who's my partner, all 3 of her kids are in college. One's out of college. So she's 45. But then you have some guys that are 70 and still holding all the cards and holding the reins of the business. And the late 40, early 50-year-old generation, more like my generation, kind of feels like they're making plans. But the ones that are 70, they're usually in a pretty tough spot already. I mean, if they've got 50-year-old kids that still don't have any ownership, how do you empower a 50-year-old guy that's worked for dad his whole life? And some of these dads are 70-year-old strongmen that don't want to let go either, right? That really is the challenge. We need the next generation to be better than us because we took over a 1,300 cow dairy from the previous generation, or came into a 1,300 cow dairy and made our mistakes on 1,300 cows with a business that had 15 million in revenue or something like that. And now we're knocking on 50. And by the time the next generation is taking the reins, it's going to be 100 million in revenue. Yeah. It's just a lot different than 15 million was 10 years ago. Right. So they're going to have to be really good. And we've got some really sharp kids coming that I think I have a lot of confidence in. But part of the deal on our dairy is the next generation. It was true for us. And we really believe it was so helpful for our generation that they need to go work somewhere else, right? For a time and need to be successful in that. They can't go work somewhere else and have no management experience and be a flunky and then come back to the dairy and as a kind of a bailout or a last resort. It's like, that's not going to work. Unless we could get to the point at that point where we hire an outside CEO. I don't think we'll have to. We might, like, because some of these kids might be so good that they go find a job, figure out they can make better money off the dairy than they can on the dairy, and then not want to come back. So you've got a challenge because we want them to be successful off the dairy, but then they have to be willing to come back too. And it's got to be able to support something probably similar, at least, to what they're making off the dairy.
So your goal is, as a family, is to say, if you want to come back, you want it to be a hard decision for them to come back. Like, this isn't the backup plan. This is laying your cards on the table, evaluating your options, and having something so good going for you that it's not the easy choice. And that was kind of how it actually was for you when you came home, right? Walk me through that period of time in your life and kind of how that all worked out for you.
After high school, my dad and uncles, they did not ever tell us that they hoped we would come back to the dairy because they never made any money on the dairy. They struggled. There's a struggle for them to take cash out of the business my entire childhood. And so my dad was always like, there's just a way easier way to make a living. So after high school, I spent 2 years at community college, didn't really know what I was aiming at, and then ended up at Michigan State in the dairy program there. After that, I came back to the dairy. That would have been, right around 2005, 2004, I guess. So 20 years ago, I was done with college, came to the dairy. I was the night herdsman. I thought I knew everything. So I wasn't getting along that well with my uncles and my dad. And I was at a conference somewhere and heard a guy talking about the next generation. And he was talking like, if you're a young guy on the dairy working for sweat equity with nothing in writing, you're taking a risk. And so I kind of started looking around, ended up in the feed business that I thought was going to be easy money. I was like, oh man, I know about cows and what they eat. And I went to work for the local co-op and I thought, I'll have this co-op sold out of feed in 2 weeks, right? Well, 6 months later, I hadn't sold a bag of feed yet. And I remember I called my advisor, professor at Michigan State, Joe Domek, and I was like, Joe, I am failing at my first career here. And he's like, well, a lot of people in the industry that are good at it, call and get in their truck or get them in your truck and spend some time with them. And I did that. I'm so thankful. There was a lot of industry reps that came and rode with me. And we were a Land O'Lakes Purina dealer at the co-op I worked at. So I went into that Purina network and into Ohio and some other places and rode with guys that were good at it and figured out how to talk to dairymen and how to sell feed. And 7 years later, I was making money while I was sleeping and needed to take a pay cut to come back to the dairy.
You initially left the dairy, went and worked in the feed business, and got to a point where it was a hard decision to come back because you were doing well in that business and you worked hard to get there. But you knew that the dairy was a place that you wanted to be eventually, and the opportunities had to be there for that. And you talked about kind of a pivotal moment for you and also for the older generation, your dad, your uncle, where you both heard a speaker at a conference that talked about succession planning. And I think it's one of those things that so many other dairy producers can relate to is you can see the headlines in a magazine and you can see the conference speaker for years until the day that it matters to you. And it sounds like there was a day when it mattered to both generations, and that was kind of this trigger point to say, okay, Like, let's actually start talking about this. Was there anything that really stands out in your mind that was significant that made it matter to your dad and uncle and to you and your generation at that point in time?
At that time, like when I left the business, I got done with college and I just did the 2-year dairy program at Michigan State. And I really thought that I was really only equipped at that time to go and work at a farm. I did not realize even then, even after meeting so many people in college, at that point, I thought it was kind of set in stone that I would just go back to the farm. And I think I was unprepared for how hard that would be. At that time in your life, I got married in that time period, or engaged anyways. And that was only a year that really I worked at the dairy before I left. But you're so impatient and you feel like you just got this education and you want to just come back and show everybody all the stuff you learn, right? And make all these changes. And you haven't earned the respect of one employee yet. It was really eye-opening. I remember once I kind of started looking around for what jobs were available, I figured out pretty fast that 20-year-old guy who's got even just a little bit of education and grew up on a farm is very employable anywhere. It's a real advantage. And there were several feed companies that then came calling that I could have worked for. And then there's your breeding companies, all of these support companies, even just knowing what I know now, like the De La Valles and the Guias, like they are starving for good people who know anything about a milking parlor and cows and a little bit handy. Like we're starving for them to have these people even. So realizing how many opportunities that there were was pretty eye-opening for me. And I think once I left, I think it was eye-opening for the senior partners. Like, oh, like if he goes and doesn't come back, and then Matt doesn't come back, and then none of Fred's kids come back, what are we going to do with this thing? I don't think none of the three of them, they built this thing with their bare hands. And I think the thought of selling it was not appealing. In fact, they had tried to sell it in the late 90s before they expanded. Right before when I was in high school, I remember driving around with mom and dad on Sunday afternoons looking at houses, and dad talking about what he was going to do after the farm was sold. And the time it was a Dutch farmer that had kind of bought it or agreed to buy it, and that bank went bankrupt and his lending fell through. And so they were like, well, we can't sell it. We're going to double. We're going to go all in. And that's what they did. And that was the year I graduated high school, is when they expanded and got to 1,000 cows, which was a big deal at the time. It's one thing if you build a greenfield dairy that's kind of turnkey and making money and you sell it. To sell a 100-year-old dairy is pretty tough, right? So I think the thought for them of selling it, and then you have to pay all the taxes and all of the money that you've made on real estate appreciation, you pay half of that or more to the government if you do a full sale. A dairy sale is not, if it's much more appetizing to think about another generation coming back and running it than it is. So I think for them, they were like, we need to try to find a way to help these kids be able to come back and take this thing over and pay us, you know?
As you talk about that, Tommy, what kind of comes up, I think, in that conversation is they had a foresight for the potential pain of not changing, a foresight for what does that do to the legacy? What does that do for everything they worked so hard for? Would that even allow them to exit the business in a way that they felt good about? And so that goes back to what you want to see for the next generation within your family business, is that it is a hard decision, that they are doing so well that it's hard to come back. So you were in that spot, and back at home, the older generations were starting to decide that they wanted to have a path for the future as well.
My dad and uncles hired a consulting firm to come in, and they kind of put together what was their first swing at a succession plan, got the whole family together and kind of laid out the rules of engagement as they saw it at the time. And kind of gave us an outline of what they thought. And part of that was we needed to leave the dairy and work somewhere else for a while. So I felt like I was on the right path. And between the years of 2005 and 2010, really for the decade, they were very successful. And it was a really good time to be a dairyman in Michigan. And they added a lot of net worth, added a lot of cows. They went from 500 cows to 1,300 in that 10 years, like pretty rapidly. And that was a big dairy in our area at the time. And then around 2010, I had spent 7 years selling feed, 6 years, whatever it was. Matt had spent 5 years or so doing financial planning, and the equity position of the senior partners was really good. So they had some equity to invest in growth. And so we started planning the next phase of growth. And I remember the day my uncle, we started looking at, we ended up building a 500 cow robot dairy, a greenfield build. And it was really exciting. I remember the day my uncle looked at me and was like, "You are going to come manage this, right? Quit your job and come manage this." And I knew that kind of conversation was coming. And I knew then that I had to quit my job that I actually really liked. I'd got to the point where I had some time, sales were going pretty good, had a good relationship with my coworkers. And that week, I think I kind of put in my notice or whatever that I'd be leaving. I didn't tell my wife. She's mostly forgiven me now, but at the time she was like, "What are you doing?" Right? Like, you're finally making us some money. And anyway, and I think we both knew that I was going back to the dairy. I think I left a job at the time making, I don't know, I was probably making 75,000 a year, which at the time was pretty good money for a young guy with a young family. That was way before all this inflation and all that. Houses were cheap. And went back to the dairy for $18 an hour and a commitment to work 100 hours a week or something like that. It wasn't 100, but it was a lot more than I was working selling feed, I can tell you that. So at that same time, so it's 2011, July of 2011, when I came back to the dairy full time. We built that robot dairy together. And really, we can say that was a good decision, bad decision. We could rehash that decision 100 ways. At the end of the day, that project that we did together as a family probably saved our business, if I'm honest, in a lot of ways, because it was something that we could all link arms and do together. Now, I know not everybody can do something like that, but it did make sense for us at the time. And we built that thing together, and hindsight's 2020, we went way over budget because we built exactly what they had always wanted, right? Learned that we were not great general contractors, but in that time period between 2011 and 2012, we put a lot of work into kind of restructuring within the same framework that they had set out at first, what would be our succession plan. We brought in a team of advisors. We had a lawyer, a financial planner, my cousin, who is kind of like an executive coach at the time and CEO, now CEO of a tech firm, and a cousin that had spent some in Times Square in New York City, like understood business really well, right? Big business, and didn't have any interest in being part of the farm, but had a real interest in the success of it. He spent his summers there as a kid. He's kind of in between my generation and my dad's. I think he's about 12 years older than me, 12 years younger than my dad. So kind of that in between. And he actually, looking back, maybe we needed you need a referee, right? Or some referees. And he was really able. I remember one conversation, he like drew a line on a piece of paper and he was like, the work ethic of you guys, and he was talking to my dad and uncles, is like over here on the edge of the paper. He said, the work ethic and expectations of normal business is over here. Your kids are way closer to you than what's normal. But like, just kind of helped us understand the differences in our generation. And he also helped us develop core values. Like he said, if you got to know where you're going, you got to know where you've been. And that was maybe one of the best exercises we ever did as a family. He said, pretend you're on a mission to Mars and think about the heroes of this business past that you would want to take with you and why. What was it about them that made the business what it is today? When they went through and talked about my great uncle Ernie, who was just this, and I never knew him. He died the day I came home from the hospital when I was born. But my grandpa always said he was the brother that was a way better dairyman. And so we developed our core values that are still our core values today. We do our hiring on those, our firing on those. We do our annual reviews on those. And then, we laid out drew up a buy sell and who was going to get shares and when and what they were worth and the vesting period and all of these things that have to be figured out. And it was expensive. I mean, it was probably at that time in 2011, I bet you we spent $100,000 that year on that succession plan. And that's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people, but I'm glad we did. And since then, we've updated it even more in the last couple of years. Once you establish succession payments, they're part of your cost of production, right? But at some point, you have to make that transition to the next generation in management and decision making. And really the thing that helped us do that was taking their wages to a very low. So what they were taking out as income in wages, we reduced significantly. And that helped the mentality of them to be like, I don't have to show up every day.
So you talked a little bit about your cousin being instrumental in starting and leading some of those conversations. And some of that was just around core values. And you talked about how building the robot dairy together was also a really instrumental thing that happened in this whole process. Had you started the transition conversations before you built that dairy, during, or after?
So the first succession plan, the original plan that they had first drawn up was already there. So we already kind of had a framework, but there wasn't that was just like the framework of what us kids had to do to come back, to have an option to come back. So we had kind of checked those boxes. Then it was time to start drawing up what does the transaction actually look like. It's a lot stickier than just dad handing it off to a couple boys. Because, if it was just Matt and I taking it over from our dad, we could have figured out a pretty easy way, I feel like, to just take care of dad. And that's what my dad and uncles did for their dad. They just took care of him. And that was his payment, really, for the dairy. So it was pretty easy to do that. Or now you have you have three uncles, and that's a little bit more difficult. The farm was worth probably $300,000 when they took it over from their dad. Well, it's a whole lot different when it's worth $20 million, right? there has to be a lot more structure to who gets what, and the equity has to be paid out.
So is this one of the most difficult conversations with you and your multiple generations, multiple cousins, siblings, figuring out how to basically make that buyout and be able to take care of the family?
It really wasn't that difficult. I mean, we had enough advice and did a fair market value on the business. And then there's a realization that if they did sell it, they would have to take a huge tax hit. So then they discount the appraised value to us. The bigger deal was like, it was really hard to decide who was going to be involved with. And because not everybody ended up being involved.
When you say who is going to be involved, you mean as far as in those conversations or in the final result of who's in management, who's in ownership? How did you figure that out? How did you work through that hard part?
We had a lot of meetings and a lot of conversations, and we paid for several consultants and mediators to help us through that.
So it required having some outside help. And what else did you learn in that experience, that hard part of this process?
I guess just really thankful that my dad and uncles were able to have the foresight to let go of management. I learned that most of the people that worked for my dad and uncles weren't going to work for me. And there's a couple reasons. One, because I was a bad leader then. I'd never done it before. I didn't know what I was doing. None of us did. We weren't great at it. We needed to make a lot of mistakes. And it doesn't matter how good your education is or how much you think you know. When you are responsible for all of the decisions, you have to live with the consequences of your decisions. And some of those were pretty painful. So we made some big mistakes in hindsight. But I don't know how you avoid that, right?
You just heard from Tommy Oesch with Swisslane Farms about the challenges of transition and also the opportunities that having those critical conversations opened up for the current owners and managers and leaders at Swisslane Farms. And tune into our next episode because you are going to hear the follow-up. Tommy just started talking about the painful mistake that he made early on as a leader and hear more about how that shaped the role of their advisors and their future for Swisslane Farms. I'm Peggy Coffeen, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. Did you know you can get Uplevel Dairy Podcast right in your inbox every time a new episode drops? Make sure you head over to upleveldairy.com. And while you're there, subscribe to the Uplevel Dairy community to get these episodes right in your inbox.